Our second reading for today comes from the Gospel of Luke. This is Luke 8, verses 26 through 35. Please listen for the word of the Lord. Then they arrived at the region of the Gerasenes, which is opposite Galilee. As Jesus stepped out on shore, a man from the city who had demons met him. For a long time he had not worn any clothes, and he did not live in a house but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell down before him, shouting, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For Jesus had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man. For many times it had seized him. He was kept under guard and bound with chains and shackles, but he would break the bonds and be driven by the demon into the wilds. Jesus then asked him, "What is your name?" He said, "Legion," for many demons had entered him. They begged Jesus not to order them to go back into the abyss. Now there on the hillside a large herd of swine was feeding, and the demons begged Jesus to let them enter these, so he gave them permission. Then the demons came out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd stampeded down the steep bank into the lake and was drowned. When the swineherds saw what had happened, they ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came out to see what had happened, and when they came to Jesus, they found the man from whom the demons had gone, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind. And they became frightened. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Now, one of the first questions I've always had about this gospel story that I want to talk about today is, was this a case of demon possession or of mental illness? We ask this because we have a more modern, sophisticated knowledge of what might cause this person's problems. If we look at the New Testament's descriptions of people under the influence of unclean spirits, they can sound a lot like what today we might call a mental health crisis. Inappropriate actions like not wearing clothes or acts of violence. The version of this story in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, also says this person was bruising himself with rocks, so we can add self-harm to the list. Another demon possession story in Mark chapter 9 includes the inability to move or communicate, and dangerous actions like throwing themselves in water or fire. It's totally understandable to us today that ancient people might use evil spirits as a catch-all explanation for much more complex health issues that they had no way of understanding. Issues that today we might recognize as anything from epilepsy to schizophrenia. And as we read in today's story, anyone experiencing any of these symptoms would frighten the people around them. And yet this story calls us to look on this person with compassion, to see them not as a monster, but as a victim. Whether they're suffering from demonic possession or a mental health crisis, the point is that they are the ones who are suffering the most from what they've been experiencing. This condition has taken them and made them do these frightening things. They've been taken against their will and locked in a prison of their own flesh, acting out in ways that have scared off anyone who might want to help them. And that may be the worst part of what this man is going through. How much rejection has he endured? Has everyone in this man's life given up hope that he could ever recover? As Psalm 27 says, had he even been forsaken by his father and his mother? Had every last person in his life cast him out because they were so frightened by what he had become? Whatever is causing this behavior in this man that Jesus encounters, the only response he's gotten from anyone else is disgust and rejection. He has become an outcast, living in the tombs because the dead are the only ones who haven't chased him away. When I was planning this sermon, I expected to be using Psalm 27 as a prayer that Jesus might say for courage. The courage it would take to approach this madman so that he could heal him. But what if the person who needed to hear this psalm was the madman himself? What if somewhere beneath all of the howling voices crowding his head, he still had the presence of mind to believe God's promise, not to turn away from him, not to forsake him when everyone else had? I personally believe that this may be true because of how this man acts when he encounters Jesus. The text says that all those unclean spirits polluting this man's soul, they knew who Jesus was. They knew what he could do to them, and they would have run away from him as fast as they could. But apparently this man still had enough self-control to come lurching toward Jesus and to fall at his feet, hoping against hope that Jesus was finally going to fulfill the promise of Psalm 27. Don't look away from me like everyone else has. Don't forsake me like my own parents have. Look at me. Help me. Save me. And Jesus does. Whether this was true demonic possession or whether it was a mental health crisis, none of that matters. Because whatever was causing all of the madness and violence and fear and rejection in this man's life, Jesus makes it all go away. Though we have to admit, Jesus did use a treatment plan that today's mental health professionals might consider unorthodox. Let's face it, if psychiatrists could take people's mental health challenges and simply cast them into a herd of livestock, mental health would be a very, very different field for our medical professionals. But then it's the same with any of Jesus' miraculous healings. The conditions that doctors today might try to heal with months or years of treatment and medications and therapy, Jesus does in an instant. And just as Jesus healed people with illnesses or injuries in their bodies, Jesus is also able to heal people with illnesses in their minds and in their souls. Because like any of the healing stories in the Bible, the point of this story, the hope in this story, is that God can and will heal people. Whether we're talking about a legion of evil spirits or a mental health diagnosis that is as long as your arm, Jesus doesn't look away. He doesn't forsake this man. He makes him well so that he does not have to be afraid anymore. And the people around him don't have to be afraid of him either. But then that becomes the new problem in this story. Yes, the people of this town were afraid of this man when he was rampaging around naked in the tombs, beating himself with rocks. We can understand that. We would be frightened of a man in that condition too. But now that he's sitting with Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, those people still found something to be afraid of. Only now they're afraid of Jesus. The problem in this story isn't just evil spirits, and it's not just mental illness. It's the culture of fear that this entire town seems to have embraced. Whether they're facing a madman in the wilderness or a miracle worker who has come to town, their automatic response is, I'm afraid. Fear is the demon in this story, and it has possessed everyone in this town. Fear was what made them make this poor man an outcast when he was out of his mind, and now fear makes them reject Jesus and send him away too. So what about people like this in our own lives? Have we encountered people around us who may seem a little off? Or maybe a whole lot off? I've told many of you about living and serving here in downtown Sioux City. We have had a few people come to visit our church and ask for help, people who have made it clear that their relationship with reality is a little more distant than we would like. And when I'm out on the street, I don't spend a whole lot of time worrying that someone is going to try and rob me and take my wallet or break into my car. Because there's nothing in my car that's worth stealing anyway, including the car. But every once in a while, I do happen to see someone out on the street who is having a loud, screaming, cursing argument with someone who's not there. Are they possessed by demons? Oh, sure, in downtown Sioux City, that sounds weird now, doesn't it? Or are they just having a mental breakdown? You see, what's going on with them doesn't matter. What matters is that my reaction to them far too often is fear. Do I see someone who obviously needs some sort of help? Yes, I do. Do I hurry up and walk to the other side of the street to avoid them? Yes, I'm afraid that I also do that. However, there is good news. Many of you know Reverend Del Olivier, who is now serving at First Congregational United Church of Christ. Reverend Olivier has started putting together a pastoral task force to explore mental health issues here in Siouxland. And that's a big subject. In our first meeting, we discussed issues from homelessness to drug abuse, because these and many other issues all influence mental health issues here in our community. We also started exploring resources that we can use when we find someone in our community, maybe even someone in our own congregations, who is having a mental health crisis. Something as simple as a 24-hour mental health hotline that we can call when someone needs the kind of help that the police and the emergency room and maybe even pastors can't offer. And part of the reason that we've begun having these discussions is so that we don't have to respond to these crises with fear. Fear is what leads us to turn away from these people who are so obviously in need of help. Fear is what leads us to turn away. It makes us reject them and turn them into outcasts. And that only adds to their problems, and it exacerbates whatever mental health issues that they're already going through. Fear doesn't help these people, and it doesn't help our community. Yes, Jesus calls us to be loving and compassionate. With the words that he spoke and with the example of his own life, Jesus calls us to look for people in need, to love them enough to approach them, and hold out a helping hand to them. But sometimes that means that Jesus also asks us to do one more thing. Jesus calls on us to be brave, to have the courage to see someone having a crisis that may be as frightening as anything you would see in The Exorcist. They may seem threatening to themselves and to the people around them, but Jesus calls us to not turn away from them, to not forsake them. Jesus calls us to look at them in their need and to help them in whatever way we can. And if we can't find those ways, we look for them so we can have them on hand later. Jesus calls us to treat them with the same compassion and love that we would show anyone experiencing any other kind of illness or injury. And Jesus calls us to do all this with the confidence and the hope that we get from the promise of Psalm 27. That God will see them, that God will not forsake them, and that, yes, God will save them. And let God's people also. Amen. Friends, will you please rise and join together in our affirmation of faith?